Okay, so far we've seen how to make tables with different types of frequency distributions. And now we're going to turn our attention to how to make graphs of the various kinds of frequency distributions. So there are many types of graphs that you can plot for data, but we're going to be covering the ones that seem to be used the most. And we'll talk about graphs for qualitative data as well as quantitative data. So what we're going to do is start with the qualitative graphs. Okay, so when you have qualitative data, the most common and widely used graph for qualitative data is the bar graph. And the way that you start drawing a graph for this particular type is start by drawing the horizontal x-axis, which is called the abscissa, and the vertical y-axis, also known as the ordinate. And you want to keep the proportions of the x and y axes at about 3/4, 3 to 4. So it should look something like this. Maybe the x-axis here, the abscissa, is a little bit longer than the vertical y-axis, the ordinate, but it's about 3 to 4. I can show you some unacceptable graphs. So we don't want a very long ordinate with a very short abscissa. That's bad. And you don't want the converse, a long abscissa with a short ordinate. Again, bad. So you want to keep that about 3 to 4, the ratio. And if you're doing this in a graphing program, it tends to be that way anyway, so you don't really have to worry about it. But since on your exams you'll be doing this by hand, you want to keep this in mind. Okay, so let's go through an example, and we'll look at the year in school of a particular classroom. We've used this, actually this data from the first day of tables and graphs. So we're going to draw two bar graphs based on this table here. So we see the senior, junior, sophomore, freshman, and the frequency and the relative frequency. And we're going to be drawing one for the frequency data and one for the relative frequency data. Okay, so you might want to copy this down before you continue on so you can see where the numbers come from that are going to be graphed here. So I'm going to just be showing you the graphs that have been created through a program here in Keynote, or PowerPoint would have a similar one. But you can see how to draw them, and we'll talk about it with specifics here. Okay, so let's look at the one based on frequency. What I have here plotted on the x-axis, the abscissa, is the year in college, or the year in school, starting with freshman and moving up to senior. So we have freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. And on the y-axis, the ordinate, I have the frequency, so how many students actually fall into each of these categories. And you can see it ranges from 0 to 10 on the y-axis there. So we can clearly see the peaks, right? Most students were freshmen and sophomores, not very many upperclassmen in this particular class. And we can also look at the relative frequency here. It's basically the exact same graph, but now we're plotting the relative frequency. So here's that, as you can see. The x-axis is unchanged, but the y-axis now ranges from 0 to 100% because frequency, right? Relative frequency is from 0 to 100%. And we've also changed the label on the y-axis. Now it's percent rather than frequency. All right. So again, it has the distributions basically have the same shape. They're on different parts of the y-axis, but they have the same shape. And so because they're plotting basically the same data, right, in just a different way. So some properties to keep in mind about these graphs when you go to create one either on graph paper or on your exams. The bars all have equal widths. Of course, my program did this for me, but you should always have your graphs having approximately equal widths. And you should leave a gap between the bars. As you can see here, there's white space between the bars, which emphasizes the discontinuity between the classes for these qualitative data. Right, it's not a continuous thing, these are qualitative, although they are ordered. And you need to label both the x and y axes, so I've labeled them with their actual title, what they actually represent, a percentage, year in college, and I've also labeled the levels, right? I've labeled freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, as well as the scale on the y-axis from 0 to 100, or in the other case, 0 to 10. And you should always go from low to high on the axes. So I've started with 0 on the bottom, move up, and starting at the origin, which is this point where the x and y axis meet. And for ordered categories like freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, here the years in school, we start with the lowest and move to the highest as you go out. So you do that for both axes. This only makes sense on the x-axis for ordered categories, of course, right? Because for unordered categories like blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, there's no order to it, so you can start wherever you want. But for ordered categories, make sure you go from lowest to highest. Okay. So that's the basics of the qualitative data and the bar graph. So now we'll move on to some graphs for quantitative data. And we'll start with the histogram. And this is only appropriate for quantitative data, but it works for grouped quantitative data or ungrouped quantitative data, just like we were talking about with the frequency tables we were looking at, grouped and ungrouped data, quantitative data. These work the same way here. Okay, so a histogram is really just a bar graph with a special characteristic. The bars are touching one another to emphasize the continuity, the continuous nature of the quantitative data. So we'll take a look at that. I'm going to show you some class grades. So imagine these are final grades. This class will be doing quite well. So we have the grades, the frequency, the relative frequency, as well as the midpoint of this grouped data. So this is grouped data, remember, 95 to 99, 90 to 94. And so we've gotten the midpoint by just taking the average, the middle point of these particular, range. Okay, so now we're going to create a histogram. And again, it's basically just like creating a bar graph, except for the bars are going to be touching here. All right, so let's start with the frequency. And you can see here, the x and y axes are both labeled. We have the y-axis has a reasonable range. We had a maximum of 10 students fall into the 90 to 94 category, so we want to go a little bit above that on the y-axis. And we've labeled it with frequency. We've labeled the class grades, and as you can see, the bars are touching, and we start from the lowest, 80 to 84 category, all the way up to the 95 to 99. And now let's take a look at the relative frequency. Again, these are just the same numbers that were in the table here that we just showed. So you can see these have the same shape, although different parts of the distribution, although on different values in the y-axis, so they're a little bit off up and down, but the same shape is there because we're plotting the same data. All right, so I've labeled the bars with the interval limits here, right, from 80 to 84, 85 to 89. It's also perfectly reasonable to label it with the midpoint. So here's an example here of the frequency distribution graph with the midpoints. I prefer the ranges. I think that makes a little bit more sense to me, showing what range is there, the interval range. Though, of course, it's perfectly fine to do the midpoint, so you can make a choice there on what you want to do if you're making a histogram. Okay, and there's just one historical note here. So as you can see, on the x-axis, right, let's go back to this one. On the x-axis, scores ranged from 80 to 99, and we're starting with the lowest interval range, the 80 to 84. But of course, right, scores could go much lower than this. They could be 0. Hypothetically, right? So new software programs just kind of start right here. 80 starts right at the origin. You don't have a gap. But back in the day, there used to be a kind of convention that you'd put little hash marks right at that start of the x-axis to show that you were skipping all of the scores or whatever up until the point you start your first interval. So here we'd be saying that we'd be skipping all the way up to 80 before we started. The programs don't use this anymore, so it's just a historical note. I want to make you clear, I want to make sure you know about. But since the programs don't use it, I won't be requiring it. Just always make sure that you keep in mind where 0 is, right? We're not starting at 0, we're starting at 80 here. Okay, all right, so that starts, that gets you through the bar graphs and histograms, and feel free to watch this part as many times as you want before we move on to the next. And always take a pause, maybe draw out your own graphs before we move on, just to make sure that you have these concepts down. All right, and I'll see you next time for the frequency curves and relative frequency curves. That'll be the next section.